great pleasure to introduce you again, Paul. And it's not many months ago that I had that pleasure in Liverpool
Mm.
when you lectured to us on that occasion. Just to remind members who are watching the lecture today, uh, Paul has spent much of his professional career in rail and community development, including the formation of the Association of Community and Rail Partnerships in 1997. But for many years, running parallel with that, he pursued interests in social and cultural history. He's worked in adult education and completed his PhD on Lancashire dialect literature. He's currently a visiting professor at the universities of Huddersfield and Bolton, published a number of books, the most recent of which, I think, Paul, unless you published another one since I last saw you, is on Lancastrians, mills, mines, and minarets.
There's one or two more on the stocks on the production line. I'll tell you about that after.
Indefatigable. However, what we're going to hear Paul talking on today is not mills, mines, or minarets. It's the principally on the preparations being made for the 200th anniversary celebrations of the opening of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. And the title, rather splendid title, if I might say so, Paul, is Rockets, Lions, and Planets. So we stand by in eager anticipation.
Yeah, let's prepare for takeoff. Well, thanks very much for that kind introduction, Roger. And it is nice to be back, although a shame not in person. I must say I'm not a huge fan of these Zooms and team meetings, and I suspect many of you aren't. But it has its uses, doesn't it? It brings people together who otherwise can't. And so I'll say quite a bit about the background history to the Liverpool and Manchester, and also some other aspects of railway development, mainly in Lancashire, because I think there's a lot of interesting things to be said. And one of the other things, just this morning, actually, I came from a meeting of the Bolton and Leigh Railway 200, which actually predates the opening of the Liverpool and Manchester. It opened in 1828. So I'll say a little bit about that because it's quite significant. It was the first public railway in Lancashire. So you've already said that, I'm very much involved in plans for the Liverpool and Manchester Railway celebrations in 2030, the Rocket 2030 partnership. And we're sort of branding, everything's about branding these days, isn't it? And so it's going to be called the Rocket All Aboard, which is quite a nice title. It's inclusive and it sort of harks back to the old sort of railway times of when I was a guard, I suppose, at Blackburn, well before that. And as you said, my background academically is in my PhD anyway, is in Lancashire dialect literature, and it's nice to have Brian on the talk. Hi, we've never met, so we really must do actually. We'd have a lot of things to talk about, I'm sure, because I'm still continuing my dialect interests. So I'm going to give you a bit of the historical background and also bring you up to date on what's happening in 2029 and 2030 and before then, and it'd be great for the society to be directly involved as active participants, and I'll give you some suggestions for how that might happen. So, but first of all, very, very generally, I'm conscious that most of you listening in will have a pretty good, at least general knowledge of the development of railways in the north of England. There's a lot going on this year with Railway 200 celebrating the Stockton and Darlington Railway, which, as again, I think we would all know, it wasn't the first railway in Britain. It was a very significant staging point leading on to the Liverpool and Manchester. But really, railways, certainly in England, go back to the early 1600s, 1604. There's evidence of a colliery tramway at Woolerton in Nottinghamshire, possibly others in the northwest, in Cumbria, in the area around Colbeck. Some of the mines there had very, very crude forms of railway. Obviously, these weren't propelled by locomotives, by steam locomotives. Very often they were just shoved by miners themselves and then by horses. And it was only really in the late 19th century, late 18th century, early 19th century when we begin to see the development of steam locomotion, and much is owed to George Stephenson and his very talented son Robert, but also other engineers as well, which I'll say a little bit about as we go along. So my focus, as I say, given who I'm talking to, will be on Lancashire. Certainly in the late 18th century, there's clear evidence of colliery tramways in the Wigan area and the Orrell collieries. Again, very, very crude tramways that took coal down to the River Douglas, and then later on, by the late 1780s or mid 1780s, to the canals, which have been recently developed. And it is quite interesting, and it's not been that well commented on, the development of Hay Foundry just outside Wigan. Some remains of it are still there, remarkably. And this was sort of very much on the estate of Lord Balcarras, one of the big coal owners in the Wigan coalfield. And he recruited a very talented engineer called Robert Dalgleish. And he started building steam locomotives in the early 18th century to operate on his lordship's railways, and actually built a loco in 1813. Oddly called the Yorkshire horse. Why did it call it the Lancashire horse? But there is a Lancashire which that we'll come on to later on in connection with the Bolton and Lee. And so these colliery railways around on the, if you like, the west side of Wigan were very, very important, and it included things like possibly the world's first railway viaduct, or certainly a very early one. And this particular steam locomotive, the Yorkshire horse, sometimes called the walking horse, walked or steamed or puffed over this viaduct, some remains of which are still extant, apparently, around Orrell. Be a nice expedition to do sometime in the summer, perhaps. So a lot of these colliery railways or tramways were sort of taking shape from the 1790s through to the early years of the 19th century. But perhaps one of the most significant developments, as I say, I've already referred to it, and being a Boltonian, I'll keep referring to it, the Bolton and Lee Railway, which opened in 1828, but the parliamentary powers were gained on March the 31st, 1825. We've actually got an event coming up in Bolton, hosted by the mayor, on that date, which you'd be very, very welcome to send a representative of the society along. I can let you have details in due course at the end of the meeting. So the Bolton and Lee Railway was divided. It was a Stephenson project, so it was building on the success of 1825 with the opening of the Stockton and Darlington, which, as I say, was a very, very important and sort of significant milestone in the development of railways, but by no means the first. And it was built primarily as a freight line. You know, people say it was the world's first public railway to carry passengers, which it did carry passengers, but it wasn't really built as a passenger railway, whereas the Liverpool and Manchester unquestionably was right from the start. In fact, it was several months before it started carrying freight after the line opened. So I'll come on to that in a moment. So Bolton and Lee was, again, significant for being the public first public railway, built primarily for freight to move Hulton's coal into the villain of Peterloo, 1819. But also he seems to have had a fairly philanthropic side to him as well. But also we'll put the Peterloo aspect to one side. But it was very much about shifting coal into Bolton, and the price of coal dropped quite dramatically, apparently, when the line opened in 1828. Like a lot of these new railways, it was a cause for great celebration and rejoicing. Maybe there wasn't much going on in Bolton in 1828, I don't know, but there were certainly thousands and thousands of people turned out to welcome the arrival of the first train into Bolton. It was locomotive hauled as far as Dobble. The wife, Mrs. Hulton, the wife of William, named the first locomotive, which was built by Stephenson's in Newcastle, named it the Lancashire Witch, and tied a sort of a purple banner around the chimney. It would be great if they'd have had photography in those days, but unfortunately not. And I've never seen any images of it, but it's something we'd quite like to do in 2028 when we celebrate the 200th anniversary. So because the line was very, very steeply graded, there were two major rope-hold inclines. There's one at Cheshire, which dragged the trains up from Atherton, very, very, very steeply graded, and also going down into Bolton from Dobble. There are still traces of the line. One of the things that we want to do is to develop a trail between Bolton and at least as far as Atherton in time for the 200th anniversary in 2028. So, as I say, it was built as a freight line, but with the intention of carrying passengers. Obviously, the Liverpool and Manchester Railway was very much starting to sort of develop traction, but what set it back was the failure of the first bill, which was thrown out in 1825 because of huge political opposition from strong vested interests, like the many big landowners like the Earl of Derby and so on, who were determined to stop it coming over their land, who also had strong canal interests. So it was very much about vested interests. So they didn't play the cards all that well, first of all, in 1824 and 1825. I think they learned the lessons from that. They spent a lot of time doing what we'd today call stakeholder management and going along smoothing people's concerns. And so in 1826, the next Liverpool and Manchester bill went through, but there'd been quite a significant delay with the failure of the first bill, which meant that Bolton and Leigh could steam ahead, so to speak, and opened in 1828, 2 years, slightly more than 2 years, before the Liverpool and Manchester actually opened. When it did, there was a link, well, there was a missing link then between Leigh and the Liverpool and Manchester Railway. So that was filled by the Leigh and Kenyon Railway, which opened in 1831 with a junction at Kenyon Junction. You can still see some of the remains of the original junction. It's a sort of network rail depot site, so it's quite open, although all the station buildings have long gone. The station itself closed in 1961, some 7 years after the passenger service from Kenyon Junction to Leigh and Bolton closed. So it went well before Beeching came along. So what that did in 1831, it was probably, there's so many firsts in these stories, aren't there? It was a first passenger railway junction, and it enabled the good people of Bolton to get a passenger train all the way through via Earlstown and Newton-le-Willows into Liverpool. And it took about 2 hours, which is probably about what it still takes you these days from my experience of trying to get into Liverpool from here. So going on to the Liverpool and Manchester itself, as we all know, it opened on September the 15th, 1830. It was marred by tragedy with the killing of William Huskisson, who unfortunately stood out as rocket was steaming past it crushed his leg, and basically the poor guy bled to death. And it was particularly sad and poignant because Huskisson was a great supporter of the railway. He was very influential in getting the second bill through Parliament in 1826. And also poignant that it was Rocket itself that was the culprit. Well, there weren't really any culprits. It was an accident. But Rocket itself was the winner of the Rainhill trials the previous year, October 1829. It was sort of Stevenson's pride and joy, and it carried off the £500, or Stevenson carried off the £500 prize money. And Rocket carried on in various guises and various operations for several years afterwards. And what was interesting, really, about Rocket was that the designers of steam locomotives in the 20th century could look at Rocket and see the features of a modern day steam locomotive being built in the 1930s, 40s and 50s, like the last steam loco built in Britain, Evening Star. It's basically a very large version of Stephenson's Rocket in many respects. Some detailed differences, obviously. So Rocket was very, very successful. The other thing that the Rainhill trials clinched was the idea that the way that the future lay very much in locomotive haulage, except the most severe gradients, such as the double incline on the Bolton and Lee, and so on. So the Rainhill trials showed remarkable foresight on the part of the directors of the Liverpool and Manchester. And that was true in so many other ways as well. And when we talk about the significance of the Liverpool and Manchester, I'd say that it's on so many different levels. Clearly, it was an intercity railway linking two already great and rapidly growing cities of Liverpool and Manchester. It was built for passengers right from the start and was quickly very, very successful in doing that. It started carrying freight in December, 3 months after it had opened. But also there's so many other things as well. It had proper signalling rather than just sort of very crude hand signalling. It recruited and was quite conscious of the importance of getting well-trained, well-disciplined staff. They were issued with uniforms, there was a rule book, and so on. And they were quite well looked after as long as they kept the noses clean. There was a strike in 1836 by engine drivers, so nothing much changes. But then it was over differentials. The company tried to reduce the wages of drivers closer to that of the firemen, who were quite relatively poorly paid. And so there was a strike, and in those days, there were all sorts of legal restrictions on strike action. So they were actually taken to court and sent to Cookdale jail for several weeks. Interestingly, again, the company thought, well, this is probably a bit too severe, and they petitioned the authorities to reduce the sentence. I'm not sure whether they were successful or not in that, but it was certainly probably the first example of a strike action on a railway anywhere in the world. Other things, perhaps more positively, the passengers were well looked after, unlike some of the earlier railways, some of which came after the Liverpool and Manchester. If you look at the engravings of Crown Street Station at the Liverpool end and Water Street at the Manchester end, these weren't ramshackle huts. They were quite substantial pieces of architecture showing a sense of pride in the railway. The stations in between weren't anything special. In fact, they were very much the sort of ramshackle hut sort of approach, but they were certainly improved in later years. Earlstown quite soon after, Edgehill ditto, and quite fine buildings, both of which have survived, and we're keen to look at ways of showcasing those in 2030. But the other thing to say is some of the outstanding infrastructure that was developed during the building of the Liverpool and Manchester. The Wapping Tunnel and the cutting with the Moorish arch are often shown in various. I'll not try and dig out images of it now. It probably won't come over on screen too well, but you'll have all seen the images of the Moorish arch at Wapping, just outside Edge Hill. Really quite grand statements. And then you had Olive Mount Cutting, which was just 20 foot wide and but 70 feet deep. You know, it was must have been an incredible sight and quite a claustrophobic feeling, I would think, going through there. It was widened in the 1870s by the London and North Western Railway, but going through it today, you still get a sense of this quite amazing piece of architecture and building. Then there was a Roby embankment, which in itself was quite a sort of significant piece of infrastructure, mostly using rock and shale that had come from Olive Mount. And then you have the Nine Arches, which was seen as really one of the great wonders of the world when it was built in late 1820s and carried its first train in 1830. And it's still very impressive to this day. You know, you can get good access to it, so you can get a view from above the Sankey navigation, actually, and seeing this very, very fine piece of architecture, which has stood the test of time. And then beyond there was a great challenge of getting over Chat Moss, which again has been extensively written about, and so I'll not go any further into that. But again, quite a remarkable achievement. And Stevenson was told by his so-called betters that it couldn't possibly be done, or it would cost astronomical amounts of money to make it uneconomic. But he went on and did it. And again, it's still carrying trains today. And you can still feel the sort of slightly soft ride when you go get past where Kenyon Junction was going towards Manchester. But, you know, it's electrified now and trains can gallop along at a fair old speed. So other things to say about Liverpool and Manchester. I think one of the things, and perhaps it relates to Roger's interest on the influence of religion on railways. There's a very, very strong Quaker element amongst the directors of the Liverpool and Manchester. And there seems to be Quakers appear very, very strongly, as do the Unitarians. And also there's a sort of separate faction, if you like, which was more old-fashioned Tory Anglican. What they had in common was that it was a Liverpool influence rather than Manchester. Liverpool was very much in the ascendancy in the development of the Liverpool and Manchester Railway, much more so than Manchester, which is quite interesting. The railway itself did very, very well, despite the inauspicious opening with the death of Huskisson on the 15th of September 1830. It very, very quickly started to generate passenger business, both first class and second class, which is another interesting feature of it. And from December started carrying freight, which also did very, very well. A mixture of freight, including coal. There were quite a lot of collieries along the line. There was cotton being brought in raw form, picked by slaves in America, shipped to Liverpool and then taken to the cotton mills of Lancashire with raw finished cotton being sent out. So it was a successful railway and formed the basis, and I think this is one of the really important things about Liverpool and Manchester, which marks it apart from Stockton and Darlington. It was the beginning of a national railway network. So you have the east-west link between Liverpool and Manchester, which very shortly extended into Hunts Bank, and where it made a link with the Manchester and Leeds Railway. That happened in 1844. So by 1844, you were able to travel from Liverpool through to Leeds and on to Selby. And the Grand Junction Railway came up from the south, providing a link from London via Birmingham up to what is now Earlstown, which originally was called Newton Junction, and then Warrington Junction, providing that link to the Liverpool and Manchester. And then another branch going off north to Wigan and on to Preston, Carlisle, and ultimately Glasgow. So the Liverpool and Manchester was really the focus of that national development of the intercity network that we really know it today, certainly on the West Coast side. The Liverpool and Manchester, unlike the Stockton and Darlington, it was a relatively early, called it a victim, or not really. I think it was an amicable takeover. It merged into the Grand Junction Railway, which came up from Birmingham, and also joined with the Bolton and Lee and the Lee and Kenyon to form an enhanced part of the Grand Junction Railway, and that was in 1845. Stockton and Darlington, by contrast, extended way beyond just being a colliery railway, taking coal down from the pits of West Durham, and ended up with a network of 200 miles stretching right across to the West Coast Main Line towards Penrith, and became quite a significant part of the North Eastern Railway when it was merged into the North Eastern in 1863. Quite a lot of spin-offs, and tell me, Roger, if I need to start winding up a bit, because I can go along indefinitely sometimes when I go. Am I all right for time?
Yeah, it's 2:30, so
yeah.
Aimed
another 10 minutes, perhaps, because obviously you want to know what's happening in the future, don't you? So I'll cut short some of the things I was going to say about the wider spin-offs, other than to say one of the things that Liverpool and Manchester also did was to stimulate the development of railways, both in the UK and the world, but also to develop a strong railway engineering industry in the Northwest. The original locals were built in Newcastle at Robert Stephenson's works on Firth Street. But then in 1830, the Vulcan Foundry was built just outside Warrington, between Warrington and Newton, by Charles Taylor, and Robert Stephenson became a partner in that. And so that lasted right through to the 60s and 70s, building diesels in the final days and to a world market. Also at the Manchester end, you had Naismith Wilson's, which came along in 1836. Companies like Sharp Roberts, who were already established in the 1820s, making different forms of machinery, particularly textile machinery. They started building locos as well for the Liverpool and Manchester. So there was this big industrial spin-off from the Liverpool and Manchester. Also, Bolton had its own locomotive building industry, which ultimately couldn't compete, I don't think, with the likes of Vulcan, and they saw the future really in textile engineering, so they majored on that. Other things to say, moving on, was that I think everybody, by the time the railways were established, by the middle of the 19th century, recognised the significance of both the Stockton and Darlington and the Liverpool and Manchester. So when the 50th anniversary of the Stockton and Darlington came up in 1875, there were significant celebrations in the Northeast, and 5 years later, similarly in the Liverpool and Manchester. And that's been a pattern that's been repeated ever since, which I think is quite interesting. It'd be good to get someone to write a history of both the celebrations for the Stockton and Darlington and for Liverpool and Manchester, because in 1925 there was a massive celebration in the Northeast, very much pushed by the London and North Eastern Railway, which was on their patch by then. The films were made, there was all sorts of reconstructions and so on, and you can still see some footage of those celebrations available on YouTube and wherever else. So 5 years later, the LMS, not to be outdone, they did something similar. This is one of my very ragged copies of the programme that the LMS produced, the official programme of Liverpool and Manchester Railway centenary celebrations at Liverpool. Again, Manchester didn't really feature all that much, but there were big events in Liverpool, including a huge pageant involving thousands and thousands of local school children. There was a sort of a railway erected in Wavertree Park with a sort of the lion running round there, giving rides to kids. So it was quite a fantastic event, the 1930 celebrations, as were the later ones, both 1975 at Shildon, the Stockton and Darlington. I went along as a young lad, and sadly Shildon Works closed a few years later. But it was, again, a great event, very much orchestrated by BR's Eastern region. And 5 years later, Rocket 150, which I was involved in a professional capacity as a guide on Green Arrow, which was one of the last jobs I did on BR before moving on. That was a fantastic success with the cavalcade from St Helens Junction down towards Rainhill. Possibly some of you listening in might remember it yourselves. I managed to get the days when the sun actually shone. I think the weather wasn't brilliant, but it was a great event, and one which we're not going to be able to repeat this time round, because where all the locals were stabled at Bull Colliery, that's all gone. It's a housing estate now. The line's electrified. It's a very, very busy, much busier line than it was in 1980. But we are looking at doing some other things as well. And let me get on to what those other things might be. I think, first of all, to tell you what the organisational structure is that we've been developing over the last 2 years, really. It was very much driven by the local authorities, particularly Liverpool, Manchester, and others have come on board, including St Helens, Salford, Knowsley, recent recruits, and the universities. And so they were very keen to sort of look at what was the significance of the Liverpool and Manchester beyond just being a railway in the sort of narrow sense. What were the wider impacts of it? What was the impact on the development of the Northwest as a whole? And also very much determined to look at the future, seeing the railways as a good place to sort of seek out a future career, see it as part of a genuinely sustainable solution to our transport problems. I was brought in just over a year ago as the chair, the independent chair, and I've often wondered what I'm independent of, and I've finally realised that I'm independent of Liverpool and Manchester because I'm from Bolton, and I think there's this historic rivalry between Liverpool and Manchester. It's something which I think it's always been a positive thing in most respects. I think it's actually encouraged both cities, or city regions, as we now call them, to compete in a positive and friendly way. And that's what we found with the partnership, really, because I think what we want to achieve in 2030 isn't a number of disjointed events taking place along the line, although there'll be lots of scope for small-scale, local, community-based events. But look at something that really is about promoting the north of England as a whole. And one of the things that we've been doing over the last few months is building links with the Stockton and Darlington Railway people up in, well, there's 3 local authorities up there that we're working with, as well as Railway 200, which, if you like, is a national project very much led by Network Rail. So the way we're structured now is that we've got an executive group, but with more and more work being taken by a series of strands, or if you like, project teams, covering railway operations and infrastructure, built heritage, community, culture, and visitor economy. So each of those are sort of developing their own ideas that are being fed in to the executive group. And I could see in all 5 of those plenty of scope for the society to be actively involved. I'm particularly focused on supporting the railway ops and built heritage side, and also community to an extent, but also having a foothold in the others. There's only so many hours in the day. The project is actually managed by Manchester Histories, which is a charity housed at the Manchester University and the Central Reference Library in Manchester. They've got a lot of experience in organising big, very engaging events, including the Peterloo commemoration in 2019. So they're definitely the right people for the job. But in each of those different strands, we're bringing in people with different specialisms, but also welcoming anybody who has whatever their interest might be. It might be in the railways, it might be in steam locomotives, it might just be in the sort of cultural impact, if you like, of the railways to the north of England. And we've got a major event coming up on March the 20th in Liverpool in the evening, which again is open to anybody who wants to get involved. So you don't have to be representing any particular organisation. If you've got something that you want to contribute, come along, you'll be very, very welcome. In terms of events in 2030 and 2029, of course, because we want to really kick the whole thing off, the rocket all aboard, with some major events in Rainhill at the start of the Rainhill trials, because I think it was such a clever idea, really, doing the trials in 1829, where you're opening up to all comers, people with exciting, highly innovative technological ideas. Can we do something like that perhaps at Rainhill? Can we get the modern day railway industry involved? We've got Alstom at Widnes, we've got Hitachi up in the northeast at Newton Aycliffe, but there's others as well, and we're still working on how that might work, but I think potentially it could be really, really exciting. And we're also engaged with the local community in Rainhill as well, who are very, very keen to celebrate the heritage. If you go around Rainhill today, it's not a big place at all, it's like a large village, but there are so many things commemorating the railway heritage. So we really want to support that, not tell them what to do, but support what ideas that they come up with. And other things, I mentioned the historic infrastructure of the Liverpool and Manchester. There's still a lot to see, and there's some things, probably the most exciting thing, it has to be said, that you can't see at the moment, and that is the Wapping Tunnel and where the Moorish Arch was, and the Wapping Cutting, which is currently very much out of bounds. But we are talking to Network Rail and Liverpool City Council about the possibility of opening that up. Ideas are still very much in their infancy. There's lots of different suggestions being made. So what we want to do is to get funding for a fairly detailed feasibility study on what could be done with that, what could happen in 2030, but also, crucially, what the legacy could be. And that's a word on many people's lips with all this. We don't just want a nice event in 2030 and I'll think, well, yeah, that was fantastic, and then there's nothing much left to show. I think that was a justified criticism of 1980, really, with the Rocket 150. There wasn't that much left, but we want to make sure that there will be this time round. And that includes doing things at some of the smaller stations like Earlstown. Earlstown, although it's not original Liverpool and Manchester Railway, it might possibly have been built by the Liverpool and Manchester right at the tail end of their existence before it became merged into the Grand Junction. But the waiting room on the Liverpool bound side it's locked out of use, but easily accessible if you've got the right railway keys to let you in. It's quite remarkable inside. It is like a medieval banqueting hall. Quite what it was used, well, it was used as a waiting room, but it was a waiting room on the like of which you've never seen. So St Helens Council, it falls within St Helens, and they've been really fantastic. They've actually got funding, Heritage Lottery funding, to do something with the station as well as other features around Earlstown, which is very much a railway community. It grew up as a railway town and stayed that way throughout most of the 20th century. So doing something at Earlstown is really exciting. There's also the monument to Huskisson at Parkside, just beyond Newtonley Willows, going towards Manchester. We want to look at ways in which that could be made more accessible or viewable. It's not impossible. You can't get right up to it, but you can certainly, from the opposite side of the tracks, get a good view across to where the monument is. In the Manchester end itself, there are quite a lot of things to see. We want to look at ways of opening up access to Chat Moss itself, perhaps as a walking trail. There's the historic pub at Patricroft, possibly the world's first railway pub, the Queen's, which is currently closed. We want to see if we can get that restored and brought back into use. I don't see myself with pulling pints, but I might try one if we can get a suitable tenant in to open it. And then in Manchester itself, we've got Liverpool Road, the Water Street, the very historic world's first railway station, still very much there, part of the Science and Industry Museum. They've had some major challenges with the buildings on the site, which are being addressed, and it's all funded. And so by 2030, the Science and Industry Museum site will be fully back on stream. The historic station, the warehouses, and other features will all be back in better shape than ever. And so there'll be a lot going on at both ends. But we do want to have events going on between Liverpool and Manchester. That could take the form of individual events, using special trains, enabling people to sort of stop off at different points. Early days in some ways, but we are conscious that 2030 isn't that far away. Certainly for some of the bigger things we want to do, like at Edge Hill with the Wapping Tunnel and Wapping Cutting, but also look at things that can happen before then, including conference events, cultural events, commission pieces of music, really look at getting the community fully involved in all sorts of different ways. And so we're really open to ideas. And so I'll very much welcome any thoughts that you might have. And as I say, if the society would like to get more directly involved, very happy to liaise with Roger, Andrew, and whoever else, and I can send you details of what we've got coming up, including this event in March